Hello, kamusta po sa ating lahat? President of PSSP, Pambansang Samahan sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino. This year, we are celebrating the 45th anniversary of PSSP. We are celebrating our organization's history, thinking about, reflecting about the challenges that we have, remembering our identity, and thinking about our future. And we are very happy at this moment to broadcast our first meeting with the division of Filipinx-American of the Asian American Psychological Association. And today, we have this meeting. We are, our panel are scattered all over the place. We broadcast here from the Philippines. We have our panel members from Alaska, California, Australia and Thailand. So, without further ado, I will introduce our panelists from the Division of Filipinx-American, DOFA. Beginning with the first chair of DOFA, one of the co-founders of DOFA, professor from the Department of Psychology, University of Alaska Anchorage, author of theoretical and empirical works on racial or ethnic minority psychology, such as Brown Skin, White Minds, Filipino-American Postcolonial Psychology. Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Dr. E.J.R. David. Together with him in the panel, the second chair of the DOFA, licensed counseling psychologist and tenured faculty member at the Wright Institute in Berkeley, California. She serves as an editorial board of the Asian American Journal of Psychology. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Alicia Del Prado. Welcome, Dr. David, Dr. Alicia. And finally, for the DOFA panel, the third chair of DOFA, licensed clinical psychologist who works as senior staff psychologist and liaison officer, liaison to the LGBT Resource Center for the University of California Irvine Counseling Center, Dr. Christine Katipon. Dr. Christine, welcome to the panel. So let's have the DOFA panel.
Hi, everybody. Should I just go ahead and start?
Yes, please.
Okay. Magandang umaga, Pilipinas. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you might be joining us, wherever part of the world you might be. My name is E.J. David. I'm honored to be here with you all. It has been my dream for a while now to have Sikolohiyang Pilipino and Filipino-American psychology come together. So this is really dope. So maraming salamat, Pambansang Samahan ng Sikolohiyang Pilipino, for inviting us to engage in this discussion. By the way, happy 45th year. That's an amazing accomplishment. Congratulations. So as you can see, I am here to talk about the need for Filipino-American psychology. But before I do that, as I always do before every presentation that I do, I must first do some acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge my ancestors. I am Kapampangan, and I'm also Tagalog on my mother's side. So that's who I must acknowledge, and that's who I come here with. I also want to acknowledge my family. I'm married to a Koyukon Athabascan woman, one of the indigenous groups here in Alaska, and together we have 4 children. Their names are Malakas, Kalayaan, Kaluguran, and Tala. And even though you don't see them here with me, they are always with me. I am a reflection of my family. And I also want to acknowledge the lands that I am on now. I am on the traditional lands of the Dena'ina people, otherwise known as Anchorage, Alaska. It is here where I join you today, and it is here where I currently live and work. So I have about 10 minutes here with you, and I just would like to quickly share why we felt we needed a community, really a family, within American psychology. Actually, it's even within Asian American psychology. Sheila, can we go on to slide 2, please? Here in the US, when people think of Asian Americans, people often think of East Asians like Chinese, Koreans, or Japanese. Even media outlets who claim, whose mission is to focus on Asian Americans, they reflect this East Asian bias. So, for example, as you can see in this slide, I did a content analysis of, like a major website that focuses on Asian Americans, a magazine that focuses on Asian Americans, a very influential paper in a very major city, and then a large a media company that also focuses on Asian Americans. And as you can see in this graph, the content for all four of these media outlets extend higher than the red line. The red line is the percentage of the Asian American groups. The percentage that they compose of the Asian American population. So that's the red line. As you can see, the content for all of these four media outlets surpassed that red line for Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese, suggesting that stories about East Asians are disproportionately overrepresented given their population size. However, the opposite is true for what we call over here in the United States as brown Asians, Indians or South Asians, Filipinos, and Vietnamese. And as you can see right here, brown Asians are disproportionately underrepresented consistently across the board. And so, this is an example of how there is an East Asian bias whenever we talk about Asian Americans. Another example, Sheila, can you go on to the next slide too? Another example is a recent documentary by PBS in the year 2020, so very recently. It received a lot of funding and a lot of attention, and there is also an intentional attempt from the producers, from everybody involved in the documentary, to be more inclusive of Asian American groups, to try to address this East Asian bias. And so I also did a content analysis of this, and despite these attempts, right, to get rid of the bias, the product still ended up showing East Asian bias, as you can see in this graph. Where like very little time was devoted to Filipinos and also South Asians, right? And this forgetting of Filipino Americans isn't new. Sheila, can we go on to the next slide, please? Fred Cordova and Dorothy Cordova, who founded the Filipino American National Historical Society here in the United States, noticed this, way back in the 1980s, right? And when they published this book, and the title of the book is Filipinos, Forgotten Asian Americans. I think we're on that slide now. Yeah. But again, this forgetting of Filipino Americans go even further back, than 1980. It goes back to 1970, when the whole Asian American movement was beginning. Filipinos already noticed that they were being forgotten even within the Asian American umbrella. So Sheila, can we go to the next slide, please? So here we see that Filipinos back then, and this is documented in Joan Rendilla's book, Pacific Diaspora. They talked about how Filipinos felt marginalized and forgotten even within the Asian American umbrella, and so they felt like they had to create the Brown Asian Caucus, right? This whole concept of Brown Asian was started in 1970. And then more recently, our dear friend, also a prominent Filipino American psychologist, Dr. Kevin Nadal, talked about the Brown Asian movement also, because this issue is still happening today. right? So being understudied, being underserved, being invisibilized or forgotten also extend to American psychology. So it's not just, America in general, but American psychology in particular. So if we go to the next slide, Sheila, um, here's a tally of psychological literature about some of the bigger Asian ethnic groups in the US. And again, this is only up to the year 2010. But as you can see, the orange bars there is our percentage of the Asian American population, and the blue bars represent um, the percentage of Asian American psychology literature about those ethnic groups. And as you can see, can we go back? Can we go back to the graph, to slide 6? Sorry. Um, and then yeah, and as you can see right there, again, Filipino Americans, even though we represent about 20% of the Asian American population, only about 2% of Asian American psychology literature is focused on Filipino Americans, right? And that was my experience when I started studying psychology here in the United States. There were very few Filipino specific literature that I could find, Filipino American specific literature that I could find. There were some pioneers, the works of Ping Serafica, Asuncion Austria, um, Maria Root, especially Maria Root, Linda Revilla, Lenny Strobel, of course, Judy Pataxiel, Patricia Harris, but many of them are working as clinicians, and they were not necessarily producing, a whole lot of literature. I found whatever the work that they were producing, though, very helpful for my own development. And then I found the Asian American Psychological Association. But even within that organization, there were very few Filipinos in it. There was Alvin Alvarez, and then Kevin Nadal was a grad student, just like I was back then, right? And so then eventually, around 2010, the few of us who were parts of the Asian American Psychological Association, we decided that it was time to create our own division. So Sheila, can we go to the next slide now? Um, so we were tired of being forgotten. We were tired of feeling lonely, even within the Asian American community, even within Asian American psychology. We felt like there was so much about the Filipino American experience that can inform many of the important issues facing our country and really facing the world, like immigration, racism, colonialism, indigeneity, and the lack of attention on the Filipino American experience, really was like a disservice to the world community. Because whatever solutions or answers we come up with for these issues is going to be incomplete and ineffective without the Filipino perspective. So Filipinos must be part of the national or global conversations about these issues, given our experiences, right? And so then the Filipino perspectives need to be part of our solutions for these issues. And so, that really contributed to why we uh, created the division on Filipino Americans, DOFA, in 2010. You can see here an email. Kevin and I were looking through old emails, and it really just started, with an email for, between a few people, and yeah, we just ran with it, and we've come a long way since then. There has been a steady growth in Filipino American psych literature. Dr. Kevin Nadal published the first book on Filipino American psychology. Um, and then I published Brown Skin, White Minds. We've had conferences, and Alicia is going to talk about those. We are now currently working on a special issue on Filipino American psychology within the Asian American Journal of Psychology. So that's the first special issue on Filipino American psychology ever. So we've come a long way in our brief 10-year history. However, there's a lot more work to be done. So can you go to the next slide there, Sheila, please? So as you can see, as of today, I just did this analysis today. You know, Phil-Am psychology literature still compose a disproportionately low percentage of the total Asian American psychological literature. You know, and then, you know, so I did this today. My friend Dr. Nadal also did a quick comparison of articles on Chinese versus Filipinos in some of the more well-known journals publishing ethnic minority research. So if you go to the next slide there, you will see huge discrepancies between, you know, Chinese focused research and Filipino focused research. Right. So we need more people to focus their work on the Filipino-American community. There are still so many unanswered questions and unaddressed issues facing our community. So yeah, we need you. We need more people. That's it. That's my piece. Thank you all so much for listening.
Thank you very much, EJ. I think we learned many things about DOFA, especially not only about DOFA, especially the need for a special organization for Filipino Americans in the U.S. And maybe at this point we can move to our next panelist, so we can have more time for our audience to communicate their questions. We now have Alicia. Alicia?
Hello. So excited to be here. It's such an honor. And I really would like to start off in a similar way as EJ and acknowledge just a few of the people that have brought me to this moment. First, I want to just acknowledge my grandparents, my dad's parents, my Lola and Lolo, Mercedes and Manuel del Prado, who both passed away the last couple years. I just kind of want to dedicate my section tonight to them, because really my identity as a multiracial woman who was born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, the reason I connect so much with my Filipina identity really has to do with the role that my grandparents played in raising me with my dad and my mom. So want to kind of give a shout out to them. And, you know, I actually have only been to the Philippines 2 times. The first time when I was 16 years old, and my grandmother took me. And then in my late 20s, when I went with my now husband to meet his parents in the Philippines. And that's another reason why Filipino-American psychology is so important to me, because of my family, my husband being a Filipino man, and also my 2 young boys that are multiracial Filipino little kiddos. And I really care personally and of course professionally about helping and advancing the psychological health and needs of our community. So wonderful to be able to think about the Filipinx diaspora today. In my first slide, I just kind of put some highlights out there of what I'll be talking about. As EJ gave a nice preview, I'm going to talk about the DOFA conferences. That email that EJ showed was awesome, amazing, kind of seeing that there were about, I think, eight people on there, and to kind of see how first there were the co-founders that said, you know what, we need our own division in the Asian American Psychology Association to really represent Filipino Americans, both for ourselves as Filipino and Filipino American psychologists, counselors, therapists, researchers, and then also for the public. And so those are kind of our 2 primary goals. Well, one of the things we thought that would help advance that was to have a conference. And so I'm going to share some pictures in a little bit on the conferences. Here's the first one. So I'm proud to say that the first DOFA conference was in Berkeley, California, at my home institution, the Wright Institute. And this was in 2016. And I think that only in a Filipino-American Filipino conference, could you get everybody to actually cooperate to take a picture? So that was all of us, and it was a sold out event. We didn't know who would come, if there'd be 10 people or what, but it was a sold out event, and always a really positive memory of presenting psychological topics and learning from each other, and really honestly this kind of instant kind of family connection. The next photo is for the second DOFA conference. This is not everybody that attended, but it is kind of a favorite photo of mine, because you can see in the background was from one of the presenters, I believe, or keynotes, where it said, "You can make a difference." So when we come together every 2 years, we are learning about the research and theory that's out there, that's current, but we're also really advancing our communities through this empowerment and this connection that we all have together. And so the next conference was in 2020, pre-pandemic. It happened in January, which honestly feels like a whole nother lifetime ago for me, but it was this year, and it happened in San Diego. And I had to put one of our members, the picture. This was the first time we had our own lechon at the conference, and it was a major highlight. And so, you know, again, this kind of idea of community as well as scholarship and clinical service. So when we think to the future, you know, one of the goals of this shared panelist that's happening across different countries is, how do we collaborate? How do we learn from each other and keep this going? And so I'd like to put out there that the next DOFA conference will be in 2022. We don't know where yet. We've floated Hawaii, Philippines, Alaska, but I think generally mark your calendars, and, you know, who knows, maybe we can have a joint conference as well. And I love this visual that I pulled, I think from Dr. Nadal's email or Facebook, where you see the growth of, in 2011, you see Dr. Chronister with Kevin and EJ. And then in 2014, the next image is when we decided to have our own conference. That was at the AAPA convention. And then 2016, 2018, 2020, we will continue to grow. We want to, but we have to. It's fundamental. We've really learned that while the field of psychology has so much to offer us, it will not recognize us or do the work just to be nice. We have to be the ones to step in and research our own communities. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to focus on is accurate measurement in psychology. So for my dissertation, I developed with Dr. Tim Church an enculturation scale for Filipino Americans. So the constructs of acculturation, racial and ethnic identity are my core areas in terms of research. And this concept, I think, shows the importance of accurate measurement, because yes, we need more research, just as EJ's amazing graphs pointed out, and we are being underrepresented. Then when we do the research, to make that research accurate and valid and generalizable, we need that accurate measurement. And as we know, that's a very common flaw in methodology. And so for the enculturation scale, this came from seeing that the enculturation and acculturation scales that existed for Asian Americans really didn't represent the uniqueness of the Filipino American experience. And so with enculturation, in this particular scale, there's 3 subscales: connection with homeland, interpersonal norms, and conservatism. And what I'd like to pose to the audience today is, you know, is this topic, which we have found to be relevant for immigrants, first generation folks, 1.5 generation, as well as second generation, third generation, etc. So I will use myself as a good example. As like I shared, I didn't go to the Philippines until I was a teenager. yet this concept of how enculturated am I to my Filipino ancestry is very relevant. And so we can measure that to see how it links to health outcomes, attitudes towards help seeking, which I think I'm a little biased here, but I think that's really interesting to think that, these cultural values transmit and persist at varying levels across the generational level and depending on how you're learning about Filipino culture. Okay. So this question of, so my question is this construct relevant in the Philippines? Does this matter? I think it does, because with globalization, with this kind of international communication we can do, I think I would conjecture that there are these varying degrees of enculturation even in the Philippines. And then the question of the need for translated versions. So, if it is relevant, I have a scale that's only in English. And so translating it accurately, effectively, not just linguistically, but conceptually, is something that is a need, and a possible collaboration. And clearly there's many Filipino dialects. And so, thinking through those complexities is important too. All right, the other thing I want to focus on in the next slide is hinting at the need for transformative research. So for a long time at my university, I taught research methods. And a lot of the students that attend our program really are hungry for application, and they're hungry for how does this relate clinically. So of course, there is a value of research and having that inform. And at the same time, the frustration that a lot of my students would have would be, okay, but people are suffering now, or how does this might help the client I'm seeing tomorrow? And so through that, thinking through transformative research, for example, this idea of doing research that's helpful in and of itself. So psychology has had at least Western psychology in particular, has had a really bad history of using participants in ways that don't help the participants. And so with this new paradigm, or new-ish paradigm, we can try to do good through the process of research. And so the participants themselves might actually benefit from being part of the research study. So I really love this approach to research, and in part probably because I'm also a practitioner and see clients in private practice. And the clinical concerns that I think are relevant for this approach include attachment disruption. So a lot of Filipino families are familiar with the attachment between caregivers and their children being disrupted, having an interruption because of necessary economic reasons, because of other reasons that family members are having to part geographically. And while that might be in the best interest of the family unit or the larger unit, there's also a cost that is seen in the quality of the relationships if the families stay apart, but also when they reunite. A lot of times it's not like these family members are just picking back up where they left off. There's a lot of pain and grief and loss that comes from that. And so I think this is a concept that I'd love to see our joint organizations maybe put our kind of heads together about how to help our family members attune and keep that attachment, to use the psychological language, secure, so that we don't see the negative impacts that sometimes kind of hurt our families when disruption of the attachment bond happens, especially early on. Of course, abuse, all kinds, physical, sexual, emotional, neglect, problematic gambling. So this is something seen sometimes in our communities where it's going beyond recreation and it's more of an addiction. toxic masculinity. So the expectation of what a Filipino man should be and how that might hinder or hurt this person's identity development and the kind of role model and father that they can be to their children. And then the other issue I think is relevant for researching is colorism. And so, this idea that the lighter the skin, the more beautiful the person. And I've worked with clients that this has been very painful for them to get that direct feedback from family members, and what that does to their self-esteem, how they feel about their body, and their self-confidence as well. So those are just some, they're big constructs, but I think there's a lot that we can look at and see how this impacts people in the Philippines, people in the United States, as well as other countries where, as we know, our Filipino community is across the globe. So I think I'll stop there. My alarm went off during my talk to remind me to keep to my minutes. And so, I think that while I have this slide, I'm still comfortable pausing because it's just further talking about this importance of not just research, but advocacy. And so how do we verbalize these constructs and have constructive conversations about all of them? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alicia, for sharing your conferences and also the research questions that we can work together. And I hope to hear more about it as our relationship progress. Okay. So at this point, I will call Christine now. Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Christine.
Hello.
Yeah. So it's your turn.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor to be able to speak to my community, both here in the US and as well as in the Philippines and in Australia, in all of these wonderful places. So as a clinical psychologist, I have my own different takes. So we've heard about the research, we've heard about the research and direction that we want to go. And I'm going to share a little bit about my own personal experiences with psychology, being a Filipino-American woman, and share a little bit about some of the experiences in terms of identity development that I experience or hear from our young adults, our college students, as well as talking about what DOFA has meant to me personally. So I'm going to, we've talked about having conversations about past, present, and future. And I forgot to start my timer there. So I thought I'd share a little bit about my past, a little bit about the present, where I see Filipino psychology going, as well as where I hope we can go with a shared future with our kababayan from the Philippines. So who am I to talk about this experience? So just a little bit of background. I'm the eldest child of Filipino immigrants. My parents came from the Philippines came to the U.S. A few months before martial law was instigated. So but for the grace of God, could have been born in the Philippines, but they wanted a better life for their family. So they came here, and I was born here in Los Angeles the year is not important, a long time ago. And so I think there were a lot of pressures being the eldest child of an immigrant family. And I started reading when I was 3 years old. And so I think it got in everybody's head that, I was going to be a doctor. And as I'm sharing my story, I'm sure that a lot of this will resonate with people from the Philippines, as well as people who identify as Filipino-American. Lots of pressure to be a doctor from both my nuclear and extended family, all of whom are also in the Los Angeles area. So my childhood was filled with weekly birthday parties because our family was so huge that we were naturally celebrating something almost every week. But some of the challenges I had in growing up, were somewhat unique, I think. I was raised in Carson, California, which is one of the cities in Los Angeles that's very heavily populated by Filipinos, but I was not taught the language. I don't speak any Tagalog. My family speaks Chabacano and Tagalog. But I didn't speak any of it because they really wanted us to be acculturated into the US and not have any reason to not have the same opportunities as everyone else. So the most of what I knew about my culture was from food and from my family. But I think there was a lot of pressure to be successful at a very young age, to be smart. And but, I'm naturally chubby. And, Alicia was talking about the body shaming and the colorism. And fortunately, I experienced a lot of those things at a very young age. And it led to a lot of low self-esteem problems because I felt my worth was based on a lot of things that I didn't think were important, because I was singing and was playing piano and I was getting good grades and all of those things. But for some reason, my appearance was focused on. So it caused a lot of mental health concerns, but I didn't know what it was. I just thought something was wrong with me because there wasn't vocabulary or language around psychology or mental health at that time in the 70s. So I carried a lot of this with me through my life, and it showed up a lot in college when I started experiencing different, my friends, there was a lot of Filipinos in UC Irvine as well. And I started getting different experiences, positive experiences of the Philippines. And all my grooming to be a doctor changed when I went to the Philippines my last year of college, because I got to go there as a medical surgical mission practitioner. I went all over the Philippines. We were assisting in surgeries. And yet that taught me I did not want to be a doctor. And it also gave me great appreciation for, Filipinos and the values. But it really did shift my perspective and make me, question my life and what I was going to do. So, fast forward to a lot of different things. This is actually my second career. I was in pharmaceutical research for the first 10 years out of college. And then I decided to go to graduate school because I had this epiphany one night of, wow, I'm so unhappy with my life. And I wish I could just help one little Filipino girl not have to go through what I went through or feel about themselves as I felt about myself at that time. And so that just became my motivation for wanting to be a psychologist. So next slide, Sheila. So the journey to being a Filipino-American psychologist was also challenging because as a first-generation college student, I didn't know much of what was out there. When I decided to go to graduate school, I was 10 years out of college, and so I didn't know who to turn to. I certainly couldn't talk to many people who had graduate degrees in psychology. So during my program, and, I think this was echoed with EJ and Alicia too. Like, there weren't a lot of Filipinos, and I didn't have any mentors. I didn't have any role models to look to. I didn't know how to choose graduate schools. I didn't know what was important to study. And I felt very othered. I felt very, separate. I had like 2 or 3 mixed heritage Filipinos in my cohort, but none of them embraced their Filipino heritage, and most of them identified more on their Caucasian side. So that was hard to have somebody who understood my worldview. And even when I was doing practicums and training with people, I just felt like, am I doing something wrong? Because it like my worldview was so different from most of my cohort who identified as part of the majority culture. So it wasn't until 2014 when I heard about this thing called DOFA that EJ and Kevin were starting. And the only reason I joined DOFA is because I'd heard of Kevin, who had written this book about Filipino-American psychology, and I had purchased it maybe like a few months before. And I was like, ooh, I'm going to meet one. I just want to meet one Filipino psychologist. And as the organization has grown, there are, as you can see from the pictures, much more than just the one. So when I joined DOFA in 2014, I started out as the mentorship coordinator because, again, there was this feeling of, I just want to help people. I don't want people to, go through the loneliness that I did. And then I became DOFA co-chair for the last 4 years until I stepped down a month ago because I was 2 years over my tenure. But what I love about DOFA is not only the research and the education and the workshops. Just for this last conference, we had we had like 40 to 50 submissions for workshops, and we just weren't able to accommodate them all. But it kept growing because I was co-chair for the last 2 conferences. It's like we started out with 30 for the first one, and now we had 60 for this last one. And I can't imagine where the workshops and interests will go as we keep holding these spaces. But more than anything, I'm hearing from our participants and our members, like how good it feels to have a community, because for many of them, they're like the only one. Like, I don't know where my family is. I don't know where, my kapatid are. So if anything, it just kind of gives us that validation that we're doing this work and it's important work and we can support one another too. So I think that's one of the main takeaways that I get from DOFA. And it's presented a lot of opportunities for me to speak to the community, speak at conferences. And really a lot of it is coming from this inspiration of, I know other people have this story and I want them to feel heard and I want them to feel validated. And speaking of validation, we made the move at this last conference to change our name from the Division on Filipino-Americans to the Division on Filipinx-Americans. And believe me, this was not an easy choice. Really the intention of it was coming from wanting to be more inclusive of, our community, those who may not identify with the gender binary. But it's really interesting, and I'd love to, process this more with in our Q&A because I'm understanding that there is a lot of feeling around the identification of Filipinx. And so it's just how do we navigate that and understanding it? For us, we felt that the majority of the members supported the inclusionary term Filipinx, and so that's what we've stuck with. But I'm open to having more conversation about it in the Q&A in a little bit. Next slide, Sheila. So one of the things that I wanted to share is it feels very full circle to be working now at the counseling center at my alma mater. Okay, I put my how many years ago, so now y'all know how old I am probably, but I didn't go to the counseling center when I was at UC Irvine. I didn't know it existed. I didn't know therapy existed. And so I think representation really makes a difference. And I would say half of my caseload is Filipinx identified because they know that they won't have to explain their worldview and why their aunties chismis and why, their relatives call them fat and all this kind of stuff. It's kind of like an understood thing. And what's really fascinating is that many of the issues that me and my friends experienced 25 years ago are still in a way happening now. And I'd like to just highlight a few of those themes. So one of them that I hear quite a bit in the counseling center is respecting your elders, but not getting any respect back. Colonial standards of beauty. So Alicia mentioned this, like colorism, a lot of body shaming. And, body shaming, again, was kind of like my impetus for wanting support and wanting to be understood. Social conformity and peer pressure. We hear this one a lot in terms of my students being compared to their cousins, compared to other people. Didn't help that all my cousins were super skinny, so there was like, it was very easy to just go right there. The crab mentality, it's so interesting. I didn't know about crab mentality until Kevin Nadal's book, but it's this idea that if you're crabbing, you don't have to put the lid on because once a crab tries to escape, all the others down below will pull them down. And I see this a lot with family members who are jealous of the student being more successful than them. And so trying to denigrate them or pull them down, as they're trying to work hard is something that I've seen a lot. Suicidal ideation due to fears of causing shame or letting parents down. This idea of pursuing a degree that they're paying for, but the student has no interest or is really struggling. I can't tell you how many bio majors and nursing majors have come to me for therapy because they are despondent, the fact that they're failing their classes, but they can't change because this is what their parents want them to. And I get that everybody is doing the best that they can, but what's happening is we're not having these conversations that are really important to address the mental health that comes with a lot of these concerns. And then finally, people exploring their identities around religion, sexuality, political beliefs, gender identity, and fears of not being accepted by the family. So the family piece is such an important component in mental health, and this is why we need to involve the families in healing intergenerational trauma. So Sheila, next slide. So what I'm envisioning our shared future of looking like, I'm going to turn off my timer here. So I would like us to start having conversations around acculturation and Filipino values and how these impact identity development for Philams in the US, because they're not always applicable. We have Western values shoved in our faces, and we're trying to balance the old school values that our families are bringing in, but also our own unique experience of being brown in this white dominant country. Talking about mental health and decreasing the stigma around mental health, increasing communication and validation of feelings. I think if more people said, I'm sorry and I love you, it would be such a game changer in terms of Filipinx mental health. More research, of course, about how Filipinos and Filipinx-Americans experience mental health in similar and different ways. So maybe some of this resonates with my colleagues in the Philippines, and maybe it doesn't. But how is it so different then, if that's the case? Then finally, healing intergenerational trauma and stopping patterns of abuse and unhealthy behaviors. I think a lot of what I experienced was part of this intergenerational trauma that had existed way before I was born. And it is, again, with my intention to not let one little Filipina girl feel like I did. I feel like I've accomplished that with this profession, as well as having the support of my DOFA family. And I don't think I would be here today in this space speaking to all of you if it wasn't for DOFA. So I'm really grateful to be here, and thank you all for listening to my story. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christine. Thank you for sharing your story and for bringing up many tensions experienced by Filipino Americans, and perhaps many Filipinos in the Philippines could relate to some of these issues, and also for bringing up the tension in the Filipinx thing, which we expect many questions later.
Okay.
So at this point, we will move to the next panel, the PSSP panel, and I am happy to say that we have two organizations today that celebrate the Filipino identity and experience. We learned about the DOFA and the Filipino-American experience in the US. Now we move to the organization that started 45 years ago, aiming to decolonize Philippine psychology and based it on Filipino experience. Friends, mga kaibigan, narito po ang panel ng Pambansang Samahan sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino. Mula po we will begin with the president of the PSSP, an associate professor from the Department of Psychology, University of the Philippines, Diliman, Dr. Jose Antonio R. Clemente. Our co-panelists from Mahidol University, Program Manager of the Forum for Ethical Review Committees in the Asian and Western Pacific region, and a former secretary of PSSP, Professor Atoy Navarro. A founding member, former president of PSSP, former associate professor and head of the School of Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales, Australia, and editor of Handbook of Sikolohiyang Pilipino, Dr. Rogelia Pe-Pua. And lastly, another former president of PSSP, director of Ugnayan ng Pahinungód, the University Volunteer Service Program of the University of the Philippines System, and professor from the Department of Psychology of University of the Philippines, Diliman, Dr. Grace Aguiling-Dalisay. Okay? Narito na po ang ating mga panel mula sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino at magsisimula tayo kay Dr. Ton Clemente.
Thank you so much, Darren. Mapapalaban yung English ko, kinakabahan ako. Okay po. So, hello po sa inyong lahat, and thank you so much to all our panelists. I'm just so excited to be here and to see all of you. And thank you so much also to all who are watching us on Facebook. Thank you. So let's just see, are the slides ready? I think we'll just have to wait for the slides a bit. Sheila, can you please share? Okay. Let's see. I guess while we're waiting for the slides, I can begin the intro. Okay. Sige. In preparing for this brief presentation, I gravitated toward the idea of PSSP celebrating its 45th birthday. Okay, the title of this presentation actually is Turning 45. Birthdays usually trigger a life review, so that's something I tried to do on PSSP's behalf. As with any review of our past, present, and future, there's usually a lot of questioning and reflection. So I might be offering more questions than answers today. Questions like the one that hopefully you're now seeing in the title. Is 45 still young for an organization in a discipline? Or should PSSP and SP start worrying about its legacy? Next slide, please. Okay. Okay. Sige. So while we're waiting for the slide, let me start with Sikolohiyang Pilipino's appeal. I have been enamored with the field since my undergraduate days after taking a course on SP. I am still hopeful and excited about this field, which is why I'm still here. The appeal of this psychology of, for, and by Filipinos is that it was and still is a relatively novel solution to insert crisis here that has the potential to improve the quality of life of all Filipinos. It is a solution, imperfect and incomplete, but a solution nonetheless to crises such as, next slide please, the indigenization crisis. Next slide please. Imposition of Western or Euro-American centric psychology, or the lack of representation in the literature as discussed earlier by EJ. Next slide, please. And issues such as oppression and perpetuation of our colonial status. Next slide, please. However, I often wonder if SP is all that, if it's that cool, if its vision and mission are that sexy, why does it seem like SP is still in the periphery? Why is it still not the mainstream way of doing psychology in the Philippines? Why does it seem like SP's appeal, second, why does it seem like SP's appeal is localized or centered on a few? And third, as PSSP turns 45, has it matured? Is it experiencing generativity, productivity like no other, in a sense that it can now look after the younger generation of scholars and advocates? Or is it experiencing a stagnation crisis with time just simply passing it by. Next slide, please. Some cases in point. If we look at the Commission on Higher Education's required courses for undergraduate programs in psychology, Sikolohiyang Pilipino is listed. So yay! But it is also an alternative to culture and psychology. Why does SP have to be an alternative and not the only and best option for undergraduate psychology students? Next slide, please. If we look at the breakdown by geographic location of PSSP's professional members this year, note that the unprofessional members are excluded. Just kidding. The number is small and mostly concentrated in the National Capital Region and Luzon. Aren't we reaching our Visayas and Mindanao psychology siblings? Does the accusation that SP is really just Psikolohiya ng Tagalog have merit? Next slide, please. And when we talk about SP, is it just kapwa psychology? Usually in conversations about politics, relationships, current events, with some of my friends from the academe who come from other disciplines. So we'd usually do a round robin and they'd share their thoughts on the matter, informed by their own expertise. They would turn to me and sometimes joke, "Oh, anong masasabi ng kapwa dyan?" Or, "So what can you say? What can kapwa say about the issue?" As a catch-all explanation for everything, for anything, kapwa pa rin, kapwa still, kapwa na naman, no? Again with kapwa. Next slide, please. Perhaps one reason why I raised the earlier questions is because I'm projecting my own insecurities, frustration, anxieties, and impatience with the field. But then again, if we're going to talk about legacy, is it important for PSSP and SP to be popular? How many are needed to form a critical mass for us to say that we've made it? Are theory building and indigenous contributions the point of it all? Next slide, please. SP has always been described as not just a discipline. Being a movement is part of its DNA. SP scholars are somewhat expected to be social change agents as well, similar to what Alicia discussed earlier about transformative research. SP's appeal to me has always been that it aims to be relevant, responsive to the times, and hell-bent on improving the quality of life of all Filipinos. Next slide, please. So perhaps the more legacy-driven question should be, has PSSP and SP contributed to Filipinos' attainment of a magandang buhay, translated as the good life? I offer a vision of what that good life looks like. A life that is free from constraints so people are capable to pursue what they value or deem important. Next slide, please. Focusing on this goal would perhaps provide PSSP and SP some focus. Instead of worrying about being the mainstream, the emphasis could be on the question, mainstream for whom? Perhaps the metrics for success of an indigenous psychology is not solely about numbers, but on impact. And planning for and assessing PSSP and SP's legacy could be based on their contributions in the 4 areas of activities by Filipino psychologists, namely research, outreach or advocacy, practice, and education. The ideal scenario is for these 4 activities to contribute to a magandang buhay for Filipinos. Next slide, please. So a quick look at PSSP's website will give visitors a preview of the activities that PSSP usually holds. So look at the activities that merited their own tabs or links. So I encircled them. We have our core activity, similar to DOFA, a yearly national conference which satisfies the research and education goals as with any other conference. We offer Linangan, an education-focused activity, which is a capacity-building workshop for teachers teaching an undergraduate SP course. We're trying to be an outlet for research written in Filipino through the Diwa e-journal. And the roundtable discussion of You and Women in partnership with PSSP is one example of our outreach or advocacy activity. Finally, what I think is one of our strongest programs and partnerships would have to be the alliance of student organizations advocating for SP. I think some of the member organizations are here or watching, so hello to the Tatsulok family. In 2019, around 40 student organizations were part of this alliance. And we try to strengthen our partnership with students through activities such as an introduction to Sikolohiyang Pilipino and a student-led conference. Next slide, please. That quick glance of the website somehow reflects PSSP's nature as an academic and professional organization. Perhaps our contribution has mainly been on developing SP as a discipline and, when able, developing a more ideological movement. Listening to Alicia and Christine made me realize how PSSP might need to be a little bit more proactive when it comes to the professional practice component. So I'm not sure if we have activities solely devoted to professional practice. What else do we need to do so PSSP and SP are remembered as an organization in a discipline that have contributed to the attainment of a magandang buhay? I'm going to wrap this up now. So next slide, please. Okay, so lastly, part of this reflection involves looking ahead. And here I present short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals. In the short-term plan, the most urgent goal would be to survive. The pandemic has upended all our plans and has made it extra difficult to keep afloat. Unfortunately, the organization has to generate income at some point to allow us to keep doing what we're doing. Another way to survive, possibly as a discipline, is to remember perhaps through the production of an undergraduate SB textbook that can be adopted, so teaching SB will be an easier decision for schools. The medium-term goal is to cultivate partnerships with DOFA, for instance. That's why this is so exciting. And I do hope that a joint conference will be possible in the very near future. So hello to 2022. That will be our election time by then. The plan is also to take care of our current community. We're not a big organization, but that should allow us to focus on the needs of our members. And ultimately, I hope that SP and PSSP continue to thrive in the near future as a long-term goal through culturally relevant and culturally sensitive research, outreach, practice, and education toward a magandang buhay for all. Okay, I hope I kept the time. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion of our co-panelists, Atoy, Ma'am Rogie, and Ma'am Grace. So before I turn you over to the panelists, let me just quickly set up what's going to happen. So Atoy will come in first, and he will comment. So I asked all the panelists to talk a little bit about something. So I asked Atoy to talk about why is it important for us to care about the Filipinx-Americans in America, and why do the Filipinx-Americans, why should they care about Filipinos here in the Philippines? Now, what is the importance of partnership and caring for each other despite our distance? Atoy will be followed by Ma'am Rogie, and I asked Ma'am Rogie to comment a bit about SP as a peripheral discipline, if that is an accurate assessment, and what she sees about the development of Sikolohiyang Pilipino in the academic community in the future. And finally, I asked Ma'am Grace to talk a little bit about her suggestions on how we can strengthen the public advocacy, public service component of PSSP. Okay, so that's it for me, and I'll turn you over to Atoy.
Okay, magandang umaga. Ano bang oras dito sa Thailand? Ngayon ay alas 10. So first, I would like to make a minor correction. Although I lecture at Mahidol University, I'm currently based at Thammasat University. And apologies, I did not prepare any PowerPoint presentation, but I did prepare a written reaction for this forum. So I was asked by Dr. Ton Clemente to give a reaction focusing on the importance of having Filipinos in the Philippines and Filipinx-Americans in the US care about each other's issues. So as Filipinos in the Philippines, why is it important for us to care about the issues facing Filipinx-Americans in the US and vice versa? But before I share my views on this assigned reaction topic, please allow me to contextualize first what I mean by Filipino and how it relates to Americans. Because as Ton knows, my background is history, so I would like to contextualize it first based on our historical development as a nation, as a people. So while present-day Filipinos come from various Austronesian ethno-linguistic groups, the name Filipino, as we all know, was derived from Las Islas Filipinas in honor of King Philip II of Spain. During the Spanish colonial period, the term Filipino was used for Spaniards born in the archipelago. It was the propagandist reformist like Jose Rizal who appropriated the word Filipino to refer to all inhabitants or all quote-unquote natives of the archipelago. The so-called Indios, Moros, y Infieles, so the Christians, the Moros, or the Muslims, and the non-Christian non-Muslims, or as Spaniards call them, pagans. The term Filipino wasn't immediately accepted and used by most Filipinos. So maybe Filipinx can learn something from that experience. Up until the 1930s, Tagalog or Taga-Ilog, people of the river, because most Filipino communities were founded and prospered near rivers and other water systems like Pampanga, Cebu, Tausug, etc., was preferred by the indigenous population. After the establishment of the Commonwealth of the Philippines in 1935, Filipinos gradually accepted and used the term Filipino to refer to themselves. So needless to say, when we refer to the Filipino term for Filipino, which is Filipino with letter P, we recognize Filipinos from different classes, ethnicities, religions, genders, sexualities, generations. So it's been said that the name Filipino is treated as gender neutral. Filipino women and members of the LGBTQIA plus community refer to themselves as Filipino. Filipino women also refer to themselves as Filipina or Pilipina, but they have no issues or qualms in referring to themselves as Filipino. So just recently, the term Filipinx was introduced, initially applied only to those of Filipino heritage in the diaspora, used specifically or especially by the younger generations of the Filipinx-American community. But now, it's also being applied to all Filipinos within the Philippines and in the diaspora. But in reality, Filipinx isn't used by most Filipinos in the Philippines. It doesn't resonate with the Filipinos in the Philippines. We'll probably, if we use Dr. Enrique's category, we'll probably need to apply indigenization from without on Filipinx. But even then, we don't know if it will be accepted or rejected by Filipinos in the Philippines. It needs to be appropriated first by the Filipinos from the grassroots, from the ground. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. This brings me to a related question. How do Filipinos view Filipinx-Americans, and how do Filipinx-Americans view Filipinos? We obviously have not only a shared future, but also a shared present and a shared past. But we also are very, very different. Our histories might have converged at some points in space and time, but they also diverge in countless ways. While there are similar, for example, while there are similar authoritarian and extreme rightist challenges that we face in Rodrigo Duterte's Philippines and Donald Trump's America, there are also a lot of differences, especially in terms of the everyday experiences, everyday struggles of our peoples. From the perspective of the Filipinos in the Philippines, regarding our idea of shared future with Filipinx-Americans, we may ask, are Filipinx-Americans part of the Filipinos' inter-indigenous dialogues, or are they part of our inter-indigenous discourses? When we say intra-indigenous, we treat the Filipinx-Americans as part of us. But when we say inter-indigenous, you look at Filipinx-Americans as someone outside of us. So to the Filipino sarili or self, are Filipinx-Americans kapwa, fellow or shared self, or are they other or iba, or both? I've always believed that Filipinx-Americans are both kapwa and iba to the Filipinos in the Philippines. And it's from being kapwa and iba that we derive our answers to the main question I earlier mentioned as posed by Dr. Clemente. Why is it important to have Filipinos in the Philippines care about issues facing Filipinx-Americans in the US and vice versa? Because Filipinx-Americans are kapwa. We share some aspects of our histories, our cultures, our languages, our psychologies with Filipinx-Americans. A lot of Filipinos, as shared by the panel from DOFA, have Filipinx-Americans as family members, relatives, and friends. And aside from that, we have comparative, as I mentioned, we have comparative challenges in the face of authoritarian and extreme rightist governments of Duterte and Trump. We are all exploited and gutted by global capitalist system that perpetuates anti-environment, classist, racist, sexist, and ageist structures in our societies. So while there are differences, and Filipino Americans or Filipinx Americans are also iba or other, they are also our kapwa tao, our fellow human being. When caring, we don't limit ourselves to people we have direct or comparative connections to. Because we are makatao or humane or pro-people, all those who are different with us, all those who are different from us, all those who are iba, in the end, are all our kapwa tao. We need to care about each other's issues because as Filipinos and Filipinx Americans that aspire to live up to being makatao, we practice pakikipagkapwa-tao or humane relations with fellow human beings by recognizing both our shared identities and our diverse identities, and more importantly, fighting for karangalan or dignity, katarungan, justice, and kalayaan, freedom for all, as espoused by Dr. Enriquez. And maybe, as elaborated by Dr. Clemente, fighting for a magandang buhay. So, thank you.
Maraming salamat, Sir Atoy, for reminding us the history of our identity, where Filipino came from, and all that, and also moving forward to caring for the Filipinx-American and for Filipinx-American caring for Filipinos here in the Philippines. Sa ngayon naman po, tatawagin natin ang susunod na magbibigay ng reaksyon. Dr. Rogelia Pe-Pua. Ma'am?
Ready?
Ready.
Magandang hapon, umaga sa inyong lahat. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. And in Australia, we say good day. I was given the task of, first, I want to acknowledge the traditional owner of the land where I am now, past and present, the Aboriginal people. And second, I would like to congratulate PSSP and DOFA for organizing this. Napakaganda. It is so wonderful to hear our three panelists from DOFA and Tonton and Atoy, and to be able to be here and join this important occasion. Can I just say that I have bragging rights because PSSP is celebrating 45 years since its foundation or establishment. And may I say that I was part of the first National Conference on Sikolohiyang Pilipino. So 45 years ago, kasama na ako. So that establishes me perhaps as the oldest in the panel of this webinar. And I'm happy to say that, and being able to see how Sikolohiyang Pilipino progressed and being able to participate as well in promoting it internationally. Now, I'm meant to talk about the academic and scholarly development and link it to international development as well. And I would like to take off from what Ton said about why are we still in the margin or periphery after 45 years. But actually, I beg to disagree. We are not in the periphery. We are not in the margin. And I guess that it has something to do with how you define the margin and what you define as mainstream. I had this experience about, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago, when I went to New Zealand to be a visiting researcher. And everyone was so excited about having me. There was this university where I went, and they were so excited. It's like, they are welcoming a movie star or something. I said, what have I done? And it turned out that Filipino psychology was very popular and still is like the idol of indigenous psychologists in New Zealand. And when we look at the other developments, what Dr. David said earlier about an East Asia bias in terms of international indigenous psychology, there's also, in Asian American psychology, there is also such a bias internationally. So mostly it's when they talk about indigenous psychology, they acknowledge Chinese and Indian psychology. Even if the advance in Filipino psychology is way, way ahead, it is not as recognized. But I can say that in recent years, because of publication, because our participation in international dialogue, it is already gaining some stature. So I beg to disagree that it is marginal or peripheral. It has done a lot of advances thanks to, in fact, the present generation of indigenous psychologists in the Philippines and a lot of the work that is being done by PSSP. You talk about, Ton mentioned curriculum, which is very much important in terms of the academic development of indigenous psychology. But I think that with its continuous training of teachers who can teach Sikolohiyang Pilipino or give an indigenous perspective in their teaching of psychology, it is seeing a lot of prospects for the future. And the reason why I want to also ask, what is mainstream? Why do we worry so much about not taking our place, not being in that position where we are considered mainstream? Let's face it, it's a very diverse area, and it also can hinge on some of the information or knowledge or expertise that people would have to give up. And why would they give up? It is something they value, that just as we value indigenous psychology or Sikolohiyang Pilipino. So I think that in terms of getting ahead, I don't think we should try to always worry too much about getting the blessing of the majority. As long as we continue here, as long as we do the right thing, and we know this is the relevant thing, it is very important for us to just focus on our work. I have a few points that, in my experience, I have seen to be very important in terms of moving this forward. We have mentioned conferences. PSSP has not missed a conference. I think this would be the only year that it missed a conference, but it is being replaced by webinars like this. One is the conferences. That is very, very important. And second is the publication. I have retired, and but when I was, after I retired, an article came up written by a very famous cross-cultural psychologist, spelling gloom and doom again about indigenous psychology. I refused to read that article because I don't want to be rattled, because at that time I was editing a 2-volume book, the Handbook of Filipino Psychology. May I promote it? 2 volumes. And this is consisting of 100 articles of the important and relevant developments of in Sikolohiyang Pilipino. And it's not just kapwa psychology. It has shown developments in different areas, even in the areas of health and clinical psychology among others. So I would like to say that publication is very important. So anytime someone would try to downgrade the indigenous psychology or Filipinx scholarship, you can always show the publication. Another thing is inclusivity. Ton hinted at this when he asked how inclusive has SP been in terms of regional development and so on. The only answer to that is let's keep doing it. That's it. Let's keep doing it. Another thing also is mentoring, which was mentioned by someone, that we are able to mentor others in order to take up the challenge of developing indigenous psychology. It's the only way. And one other idea I would like to share is the idea of cross-indigenization. This has been promoted by Enriquez and some of us in terms of the idea that eventually indigenous psychology's goal is to become known outside the Philippines. And I think that the inroads to it being promoted in America is seeing its fruits in the inclusion of DOFA here and the developments that they talk about. And we may not be aware, not only in New Zealand, but in Indonesia, Malaysia, and other places, they look up to Philippine indigenous psychology. Why do I say that? Sometimes we feel that it is not important to be known internationally. We should focus just on the Philippines. But the reality is they go hand in hand. Some recognition from outside the Philippines adds to our own recognition within the Philippines. So cross-indigenization is basically the concept of working together to find out whether the indigenous concepts we are working on have parallel or similarity with other indigenous psychology. And even if they have differences, the idea is that the indigenous psychologists would come together and share and probably work collaboratively, do some research together in order to come up with a more universal psychology than what is being offered or recognized at present, which we all know is not universal at all. So cross-indigenization will work academically in terms of that collaboration with other indigenous psychologists in other areas. Within the country itself, cross-indigenization will come in the form of different regional psychologists working together. In America, it would simply mean different DOFA members working together as well. I think that because of time limit, that's all I could share. But one thing I want to say is that we need to be active also in debating or putting forward what we have known. Sometimes we are too modest in terms of what we have achieved. It's time to be forward and claim our name in terms of our achievement in the area, not only nationally, but internationally. That's it. 10 minutes. There's my timer.
Lakas ng alarm. Thank you, Ma'am Rogie, for reminding our accomplishment and putting back in our working memory the importance of acknowledging our own achievements. At this point, we will move to our next panelist, Dr. Grace.
Yes.
Ayan.
Okay. So,
Okay. It's your turn, ma'am.
magandang umaga sa ating lahat. Magandang hapon at magandang gabi kung saan man tayong lahat naroon. Unang-una, gusto magpasalamat sa PSSP sa paanyayang ito. I would like to thank PSSP and Ton specifically for the invitation to join the panel this morning and to congratulate him and PSSP and DOFA, for coming together, for bringing these two panels together. It's been said that in any crisis there is opportunity, and I think one of the things that has positive things that has come out of the situation is the opportunity to interact and meet one another online, such as the first, session that we're having this morning. I've been asked to focus more on advocacy, uh, primarily because of my work, in the volunteer service program of the University of the Philippines and in the volunteering sector. No? But allow me to comment first on some of the things that Ton mentioned, a very comprehensive, presentation inviting food for thought. Of course, okay, wala siyang picture ng lechon, but again, this brings us together in trying to look into topics that have been raised several years before. Okay, so my sharing is coming from my experience with Sikolohiyang Pilipino. I was fortunate to be a student of Virgilio Enriquez. Okay, uh, I came in a bit later than Rogie, so who's the founding daughter, founding member of PSSP. But it really was very informative, not only to have Dr. Enriquez as teacher, but as mentor, and to see him as a person who really lived what he talked about when he discussed Sikolohiyang Pilipino. In terms of advocacy, I'm also coming from work that I've done with the late Ledivina Carino on volunteering, and this has helped me shape, volunteering in the Philippines. I'd like to thank my colleagues both at the Ugnayan ng Pahinungód, the Pambansang Samahan sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino, Voice Network, and of course the Department of Psychology of the College of Social Sciences and Philosophy in UP Diliman for the opportunities to engage in conversations and activities on Sikolohiyang Pilipino. So it's our 45th birthday. As a developmental psychologist, one would say what happens when one is 45. So that's usually seen as the start of middle adulthood or midlife. And what happens in midlife? There's stress, there are possibly doubts, but it's also seen as a stage of life transitions. Many things can change. So we talk about the transformative aspect of Sikolohiyang Pilipino. At 45, one looks back at what has happened and looks forward to seeing new things to come. At 45, we're the middle age, which is 45 to 60. Usually one is expected to be more actively involved in the civic life, of one's community, to be more socially responsible. And I think that's pretty much where we are in the Pambansang Samahan sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino. I think that PSSP has made inroads. I will not repeat what Rogie has mentioned earlier and other panelists, but we are, I think, in the stage where we have a lot of things to look back on and to be proud of these things that we have accomplished in the last 45 years. Also taking note of the comments, the critiques that people have made against SP, which is all part of growth and development. One of the things that has been mentioned about PSSP, about SP, and which Don mentioned is in his presentation is what is again SP 45 years later. But we do ask ourselves at 45, who am I and what have I been and what do I want to be in the next so many years forward? When we ask ourselves these questions or we ask about SP, I think one of the things that has been mentioned is language. So when people say, hindi ba ang SP ay sikoliyan ng mga Tagalog? I remember always telling my classes in SP, no matter where these classes are held, okay, that's precisely the reason that we have these classes, so that people are able to contribute their own perspectives, coming from their culture, coming from the regions, no, where they grew up. And the limitation as to language will persist only if people do not engage in conversations about this. So I guess even to this date, that is a topic that we should engage in. No? There were bitter arguments in the past about uh, what will happen if one publishes or speaks or writes in English. What does that mean? Does that make one more or less of something? And I think it's good to go back to that discussion, not just so there is argument, but to see how we have managed also to address that situation. Okay. Another thing that has been said of SP, and I think we will remember, no, the first textbooks on Sikolohiyang Pilipino that Rogie published, no, SP. We always think, well, I always think of it as that yellow book on Sikolohiyang Pilipino, teorya, metodo at gamit, theory, research method, and practice or application. So when we talk about SP and saying, well, there are developments in the area of teaching, and we see the curriculum in higher education, identifying SP as one of the two courses that one can look into. I think that is already a fruit of the work that SP has done. We also talk about research methodology, and earlier in the DOFA panel, I think there was mention of the research methodologies that would be appropriate to use in the kinds of things that we are interrogating or wanting to explain and understand. And then separately, there is the practice, or in one slide that I saw, practice and outreach as well. Okay. I understand and I support developments in this area, but I'd also like to think that if we talk about engaged scholarship, all of these come together so that it can be difficult, okay, or even unnecessary to dichotomize, to partial things out, to compartmentalize and say that SP in this area is teaching, in this area its focus is research, and in this area it's practice. One example would be in teaching where we use service learning, for instance, where there is a lot of, you might say, outreach as part of learning. And I think that Sikolohiyang Pilipino lends itself very much into teaching our students, at the same time doing so by providing opportunities for service and learning about themselves and the communities that they engage with. Okay. So let me maybe shift into what I've been asked to do primarily, and please just signal me if I'm going overboard. I forgot to turn on my timer. So the area that I've been active with in the last so many years or decades has been in the volunteering sector. And volunteering, as some of you might know, formal volunteering in particular is celebrated in the Philippines every December. We have in the Philippines what is called the National Volunteer Month, okay, by Presidential Proclamation number 55 series of 1998. So since 1998, the Philippines has been celebrating National Volunteer Month in December. And the work that we do in volunteering, not only in the University of the Philippines through its Ugnayan ng Pahinungód program, but in the Philippines through various volunteer organizations. Okay. it shows the kind of contribution that we have to the international volunteering arena. No, I recall decades back when the voluntary services overseas was just looking at international volunteering at the time. So there was a lot of debate on, whether Filipinos should volunteer abroad or should stay in the Philippines. And in those discussions, I think what became very clear was that Filipinos serve anywhere and everywhere they're at. Okay? There was also an appreciation for what was then called international volunteering and national volunteering, and that bringing together people who had served in different parts of the world would contribute to a better understanding of volunteering. So, what am I saying? That it is important to recognize the work that is done in the Philippines in the volunteering sector. And by saying so, I would like to think that this is really Sikolohiyang Pilipino in action, because this reminds us of what Enriquez himself had said about Sikolohiyang Pilipino, that Sikolohiyang Pilipino is a liberation and a liberating psychology. And it is through volunteering, okay, understood as serving that is sa sariling kusa, na walang kapalit, at para sa kapwa. I know that my two co-authors are here. One is on the panel, Atoy Navarro, and I just saw a comment from Jayakat. Okay? And so, given that, I think even articulating volunteering to be that is Sikolohiyang Pilipino in action. And the many activities that we've done. So if you look at Sikolohiyang Pilipino as being liberating, okay, and a liberation psychology, we look towards the empowerment of people, the transformative nature of volunteering, so that people are able to address their own issues, to address concerns, and for themselves to work in partnership with others to making a better life for everyone. When we talk about volunteering, I think one thing that has been very clear, no, in the last years is we no longer use the term beneficiary. Okay? We talk about community partners because really development is something that is done in partnership. It is not a unilateral activity. Okay? And to me, this resonates very much with the Enriquez view of research, where we do not talk about our research partners as subjects. They are not subjects, they are participants. We work with them toward a common goal. So again, in this area, I'd see that Sikolohiyang Pilipino is alive. It is something that is really very clearly articulated in the way that we do our advocacy, and from my particular perspective that I am speaking about today, that would be volunteering. So I think I've used up my time, but I think that again, Sikolohiyang Pilipino, when we talk about teaching, we talk about direct and indirect strategies, and I think that Sikolohiyang Pilipino is taught in many different ways, directly using direct and indirect strategies. But one of the ways by which Sikolohiyang Pilipino is discovered, is disseminated, and appreciated by people is through the different formal and informal, indirect ways that we share our knowledge and experience of Sikolohiyang Pilipino. And in this particular instance, it is alive and well in the volunteering sector. So thank you very much.
Maraming salamat, Doc Grace, especially for reminding everyone sa spirit ng Sikolohiyang Pilipino, which is to bring about positive change, to engage especially in volunteering. Maraming salamat po. At this point, makakasama natin si Dr. Danny Ochoa of University of the Philippines, Diliman, our Secretary Kalihim ng Pambansang Samahan sa Sikolohiyang Pilipino to read the questions of our audience, and then we'll have our panelists to answer them. Danny, pasok.
Hey, thank you so much to our panelists for these wonderful perspectives, no, and telling us about the work of both organizations. So we have a couple of questions from our Facebook feed. I think we've been getting a lot, mostly greetings and some positive comments, no, but we do have these questions. And one asked, sorry, I forgot to copy the name. How do you feel towards representation of Filipinos in the media, especially in international screens? And so anyone from the panel, please feel free to jump in and respond.
This is good for the DOFA and the PSSP panel.
I volunteer Atoy for the question on Filipino representation.
In the Philippines, how are Filipinos represented? I think
And
we have made some strides in representing different Filipino identities, but as we all know, still, like in history, like in psychology, there are still dominant identities that are represented. So basically, Tagalogs, Christians, there's a kid there. Then, especially heterosexual, those who identify as heterosexual. So while we've made strides in being able to represent the diverse Filipino identities, there are still some dominant representations that we need to challenge. We need to continuously challenge. So whether it's in the Philippines or how we are represented internationally, we can see that.
thank you, Sir Atoy. Would anyone else like to jump in?
I think I just want to echo what Atoy shared. First of all, I learned so much just listening to everybody. By the way, thank you,
Yes,
thank you for that.
you.
Yeah, my mom, we have the Filipino channel, so we get TFC here, and my mom watches it all the time. And one of the things that I noticed a lot is that many of our so-called movie stars or celebrities and our beautiful people, they tend to be, as some of y'all already alluded to earlier, light-skinned folks or mestizos and mestizas, and then they're the ones who are often, playing the top characters or the major roles, right? The bida, and then the contrabidas are usually the poor or the dark-skinned people, right? And so to me, like psychologically, how does that affect the Filipino psyche and the Filipino masses? So I think we need to make dark skin cool in Filipino media.
Okay,
And not
thank
just
you.
dark skin. Yeah.
I also have something. Oh, Christine, go ahead.
No, well, I was just gonna hop on not just the colorism, but also all shapes and sizes and heights and everything. And one of the things that I brought up with a lot of my students at the LGBT Resource Center at UC Irvine is my understanding, like whenever I see TFC on at a Filipino restaurant that I'm eating at, if I'm watching a variety show, those who are identified as LGBT are very flamboyant and very exhibiting the stereotype, and yet the homophobia in the Philippines is quite rampant, and so it's almost as if the representation is that of being laughed at or being a joke. And I'm also curious about that because I haven't seen a whole lot of positive representation for the LGBT community in Filipino media. I don't watch a whole lot of it, but what I have seen, that's been my observation of it as well. Go ahead, Alicia.
Thanks.
Alicia, can I comment first on?
Sure.
I think we need to point out that it's not because they're flamboyant or effeminate that's the issue. That's not the issue, because we have a lot of flamboyant and effeminate gays in the Philippines. The issue is that when they are represented as one-dimensional,
Yes.
without depth. So I think, and they're limited to being comic relief. So because we also have to recognize that, flamboyant, effeminate gays exist in the Philippines. They have a lot of. We have a lot of these types of gays in the Philippines. So the issue is not because they're effeminate or flamboyant, but
No,
because
you're correct.
they
It's
are
one-dimensional.
represented, as one-dimensional, as comic relief without any depth, without any character depth. So I think
Thank you.
just 2 points.
You said that much better than I did, but that's exactly what I meant.
I was thinking about the point of just underrepresentation, and I kind of noticed that because when we are watching television that is U.S. TV, when there is a Filipino identified person on the screen, we get very excited in my house, and we look them up and we Google them, and I think the fact that it feels more like a rarity, although there are more and more of us being represented on screen, shows that it is not a common occurrence. And as we know, it's so important for role models, for our youth and as well as our adults. The other thing I think we need to be really vigilant of is that representation that is one-dimensional. And a while ago, I believe, EJ, we collaborated on a piece that you initiated about a show that was going to come out that was about mail order brides. And it was intended to be a comedy. And it was going to feature a Filipina in that. And, EJ, I want to give you so much credit for raising this issue. I think it was NBC. I'm not sure, but a mainstream U.S. network. And EJ was really wonderful in pointing out the problems that with such minimal representation, to have that be the representation for the Filipino community was problematic on multiple levels. So wanted to raise those points as well about where we need to grow.
Okay, thank you so much. Suddenly we have a flood of questions on Facebook, so I think we'll move on to those others. I will just choose among them, I think. So Simon Brias, one of our co-faculty at UP, asked, how can Sikolohiyang Pilipino and Filipinx-American psychology find renewed applications in our current socio-political contexts, especially considering increasingly salient forms of oppression like racism, social immobility, SOGI-based discrimination, and democratic backsliding, which SP aimed to be a protest against? Tough question.
I think we have a very quick answer for this one, and maybe Atoy, Roger, and Grace can also chime in. I've always been interested in the role of values and beliefs in shaping people's behaviors, and I think that's one of the strengths of Sikolohiyang Pilipino, the way that we started talking about values. What is interesting for me is that these things are often very difficult to change and very difficult to target. So although we know that particular values and belief systems do predict particular discriminatory behaviors, I think I'd like to explore more how we can utilize, for instance, the role of families and parenting and friendships, and communities in kind of changing values, if that's even possible, especially in such a short span of time. I don't know if that made sense, but maybe the other panelists would like to chime in.
Maybe just to say that the question seems to be very large, but I don't think that there is just one answer. I think we contribute to this in the different types of work that we do, and for teachers in the different classes that they teach. But I think it's important for us also to highlight diversity and inclusivity in the work that we do, knowing that it is still a challenge, I think, in the Philippines to be able to partner and to incorporate learning from our different ethnic communities in the country. I think that is one of the things that we can look into. I think in the daily conversations that we have, and I imagine not brown bag lunches, but I don't know. Now we also have digital online lunches. I think people do that these days. But I think in conversations, just sharing the view that we have about Filipinos and the work that we do, not laughing at jokes that are insulting to Filipinos. I think that's one very practical way of addressing the concern that Simon very interestingly has put up. So very simple, little simple ways, as well as maybe the big researches, no, that have been mentioned, and looking at maybe coming up with programs, intervention programs, let's say from studies done on values that Thomas mentioned.
Can I add something? Uh, I agree, it's a very, very big question, and you can actually, all of us can participate from different angles. Like in Australia, I find that the law is very important. The law is very important so that you don't see that much racism or discrimination that is not being lambasted by media. So as soon as someone says something that is, slightly racist, then that really comes up, and you get the society really condemns that. So that's one angle for us to be active in promoting or advocating for such law. Second is in terms of the group mentality of pakikibaka. I remember Dr. Enriquez said that one thing that he found in the portrayal of Filipino values is that what is emphasized is that niceness, kagandahang loob, pasensya, and so on. We forget that pakikibaka is as important, and justice, katarungan, fighting for justice, fighting for our freedom, they are as important, but they were not highlighted in the Western portrayal of the Filipino values. I remember that with what is happening in the Philippines, I asked my friends, I said, what is happening to the Filipino people when we revolted against Marcos several times ago, several years ago? We went to EDSA, not being afraid for our life. I remember my mother-in-law saying, why are you going? Don't you worry about your children? And I remember saying that it is for our children that we are going there. And the reply I got from my friend is that she said that even the left are split. They are divided in terms of their, opinion of the political situation. I don't want to name names, but I think that that is something that seems to be evolving, and apparently there is something very different in the environment now that people are not able to call on that pagkikibaka and that sense of justice and freedom. But what I'm saying is we can attack it from different angles. And that's one thing that it seems to be a white elephant in the country, in the Philippines right now. Sorry if I uh, touch on sensitive issues with that.
So maybe you're the best person to say that in the panel. But
So,
maybe I just chime in, coming from Roger's comment and the rest. Again, no, from my volunteering background, and talk about the Sustainability Development Goals. Uh, uh, and SDG 17 in particular is Partnership for Development. And what it's saying is that we'll only achieve these 16 goals if we are active in partnership towards achieving those goals. And I think that's true, no, for us. And so Simon asks about addressing our social political context. There are very intangible reasons, I think, that's for fear and anxiety. And I guess one of the ways of addressing this is to have stronger partnerships within the Philippines, the Sikolohiyang Pilipino, with the Tatsulok, with the Philippine Association, the PEP, with maybe the mental health associations, and everyone coming together, and now knows this wonderful opportunity of partnering with DOFA. I think we have to come together so we have a stronger stand, no? Not just to to make us more confident, no, in bringing forward what might be tagged a certain color, but again, understanding why these things need to be said, and after that, how action needs to be taken so that transformation can occur. So it's, to me, partnership is important. It's imperative, and I think we have a very good start today.
Thank you, Ma'am Grace and Ma'am Rogie. Does anyone from DOFA want to respond to the question?
I'll just say briefly that
Okay, sure.
our current, political events require us to be as supportive of our community as possible. And we do have the challenges that many families are being torn by political beliefs. And so as psychologists, trying to be able to provide that space for people of all beliefs has been a challenge, when we want to, when we're saying we're experiencing the same struggles as well. So I think it's a real honor and privilege to be able to hold space and recognize that we are also working our own processes of how do we become activists and how do we promote mental health in the midst of a situation right now where racism and political activism, like negative political activism, is so rampant right now in our country as we're awaiting the results of our U.S. election. So, yeah, it's.
And I'll add to that too, that I think that psychology research has so much to offer for understanding how people are making their political decisions. 4 years ago, I was surprised to learn that Filipino Americans were the highest Asian American group to vote for Trump. And so, this concept of how and why, and in terms of enculturation, the construct of conservatism is something that came up, and this kind of belief in hierarchical values, and also the importance of religion, particularly Christianity and Catholicism, and how that is kind of possibly, a research question is, how is that playing into this decision making, versus for some other Filipino Americans where maybe racial identity and ethnic identity is more central to their self-concept, and is that influencing maybe another, more the Democratic Party that focuses more on racism? So I think we can try to understand that more, in my opinion, because I'd like to for advocacy and fighting oppression. But of course, there's a role of the objective science of looking at the correlations.
Okay, thank you so much for that. There's so much work to do, really, for all of us. And so we'll have one last question. And this is actually a combination of questions from Deborah Gale and Tatsulok. So what advice would you give for early career psychologists and students who wish to be involved in furthering clinical and also Sikolohiyang Pilipino work and research?
I would say find a mentor. I wish I had one.
Mm.
I wish I'd known about all of the organizations. But, if you didn't have a mentor, be a mentor. If you don't have one, look around. I mean, there's some wonderful people on this panel, and we can, work together in creating connections. So that's my biggest piece of advice, to know that you're not alone in doing this work.
Maybe for psychology students, it's very important to study with and work with the disenfranchised, the marginalized, the oppressed peoples in the Philippines, and if you're doing inter-indigenous studies, also those in other countries. So at least we are able to generate understanding from these types of studies that will further our movement for social justice. So not only in the Philippines, but in different countries of the world.
Okay. So if I
Can
may,
I just
okay, Rog, go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that it's probably a shameless plug, but I think joining PSSP is a wonderful way of working with graduate students and psychologists and furthering work in whatever area of psychology we would like to specialize in, to actively participate. I mean, there's a lot to be learned in organizing a conference, because it helps us see what people think about things that probably we assume as understood the same by everyone else. It gives us the opportunity to present our research papers, our good practice papers. And while that may sound tongue-in-cheek, I really do think that being a member of an organization, even as an undergraduate student, provides us wonderful opportunities of learning about psychology, and also sharing what we do know at whatever stage we are in our lives in psychology. That's it.
I just want to share that I was an undergraduate student when I started being involved in Sikolohiyang Pilipino. And when I became a lecturer, I started involving my own students in developing the first book, the yellow book that Grace mentioned. It was with the help of the students. So both for the teachers and students, I would like to suggest that this continue, following on also from what Grace just mentioned, the working together in terms of producing something tangible, because this then becomes a legacy. This then becomes a model, an example for other mentoring projects in the future. So being close to your teachers, and the teachers be having the students close to you in terms of getting their hands dirty in developing materials that we need.
Just one more thing I want to add. When I was secretary of PSSP, maybe close to a decade ago, so when I was going through the documents of our organization, so I came across our first international conference. So unang pandaigdigang kumperensya. So in 1994, that was around the time when Dr. Enriquez passed away. So maybe it's important to rekindle that connection that we had in 1994. That's more than 2 decades ago. Of course, we have the annual Kapwa conference, international conference, when we see Filipinx-Americans and Filipinos exchange ideas, share ideas. But maybe looking forward, so we hope to have more of this, and hopefully we are able to develop more theories, methodologies, and applications that are relevant for both Filipinx-Americans and Filipinos. So maybe we can have the second international SP conference. Ikalawang pandaigdigang kumperensya. Because after the first, nothing followed. So maybe
So good DOFA.
after 1994, No more. But we have the Kapwa International Conference.
Anyone else? Maybe from DOFA?
Just plugging DOFA. You can join DOFA if you're in the US. Forgot about that.
Oh, it's good you mentioned it. So I was thinking, is cross membership possible? Like DOFA members also being members of PSSP and vice versa. Is there something that we can work on, no, around that? Because international organizations usually have like affiliate members, international members. I don't know if we'd like to see one another as affiliates or as full-fledged membership, but I thought it might be something that we can think about.
Yeah.
I think that's really, I personally really like that idea because I think it sets up nice infrastructure. And so it's a way to kind of establish, and of course, I think it would warrant, town hall discussion and, make it be ground up if that's what our memberships wants. But it sounds like such a nice idea to make this a lasting relationship in a concrete way. And I'm totally for the international conference. And I also just want to add the inclusivity piece. And I think that if there are students out there that don't feel connected yet to our organizations, don't let that stop you. I think that, the one way you can feel connected is by throwing out how to be more connected. I mean, the way DOFA came out was because we weren't feeling as connected to AAPA, so we created our own division. So I think that there can be subgroups as well in that. And I'll do a shout out to one of my former students that's watching as well. And they created their own Kapwa Collective, group of Filipino-American graduate students, and found their own group. And it's not in competition with DOFA. It's just another way that they have developed their own group. So, yeah.
And I think that we can really maximize the use of technology, the benefit of technology. Like, this is the first webinar I have attended, and last week I was just asked to be into a class in New Zealand, which is about indigenous psychology. I think that there's a lot of potential here, and I know I'm now in Australia. I cannot be elsewhere, but with the webinar, I'm still able to contribute. So I think that this is a very, very good start, and kudos to PSSP and DOFA.
Yes. So Jay is also plugging. So the University of the Philippines, Diliman, have a graduate program with concentration in Sikolohiyang Pilipino, so for MA and PhD. So applications are ongoing.
That is a plug.
Okay, it seems Darren can't get back in. So there he is. Okay. There you go.
Yeah, nakabalik na ako. Okay, so thank you very much to our dear panelists. And we are very happy to remember and think about our shared past, shared present, and shared future. And we wish that our relationship, DOFA and the PSSP, continues to warm up as we move forward, and maybe we can have more projects in the nearest possible time, so we can continue in embracing our common identity and provide solution to our kapwa Filipinos wherever they are. We also want to remind everyone, to our dear audience who wish to get certificates, you can go to the PSSP link where you can get the evaluation form for this webinar. You fill them out and you'll get the certificate afterwards. Thank you very much, everyone. We had a very fantastic day. Thank you.
Thank you too, Darren. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Karen and Danny, thank you so much
So,
to all of you.
Pinoy na Pinoy, may picture na ba?
Picture muna tayo. Picture.
Of course.
The Pinoy.
Your webcam will have a photo op.
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
EJ's kid. How old is your kid, EJ? Cute.
Ready?
Okay.
Sige. 1, 2, 3. Say cheese.
cheese. SP.
Monkey.
DOFA.
Isa pa. One more. Teka, may nagtitake ba ng photo?
I thought you were taking the
Isa
photo.
pa.
We thought, yeah.
Isa pa. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Maraming salamat po.
Bye.
We'll be in touch.
Let's keep in
Nice
touch.
to meet you, Roger.
Thank you to everyone watching on Facebook.